have a son, Jack, and a daughter, Alyssa, and am married to Tom. Tom is Alyssa's father, but Jack's father is my ex-husband, Dan. Dan and I had a pretty ugly custody fight, and he lives in New York while we live in Texas. Over the years, Dan has unsuccessfully tried to get Jack to move in with him. It wasn't easy to fight him off since he is a very successful lawyer. Jack is a pretty popular kid in school. His friends on the wrestling team came up with a prank for him to ask a heavily autistic girl who had a crush on him to the prom as a joke, and for him to show up wearing a gorilla suit. Jack originally said no, but the wrestling team actually raised a fund which got to be somewhat north of $800 for him to do it, and they paid for the gorilla suit. Jack agreed. If it matters, this is very out of character for him. After the prom, I was looking around on Instagram and saw pictures of him in the gorilla suit and was surprised that he didn't take his girlfriend Jess. After reading the comments, I learned what happened. To say I was furious doesn't even do it justice. I woke Jack up as soon as I saw it and screamed at him until my lungs give out. Then when Tom heard what was going on, he joined in. Tom and Jack have never gotten along. I can't prove it, but I suspect Jack's father, Dan, has a hand in that. Jack told Tom, F-worded off, I'm talking to my mother. So we took away all of Jack's electronics, his phone, and we had paid for a car for his graduation present. Because of his prank and disrespect to Tom, we instead gave it to Alyssa. We also forced him to give us the $800 and plus, and we gave it to his date and made him write a letter of apology. He was also grounded for a month, and we canceled his 18th birthday party. On Jack's birthday, there was a knock at the door. It was Dan, and he had suitcases. Tom said, "What is this?" "The custody agreement says you don't get him on this birthday." Dan just looked past Tom and said, "Hey kid, I'm here for the jailbreak." He then pointed at a Mustang and said, "Hope you like Fords. You can practice driving your new car on a road trip back to New York. Let's take a detour to NOLA." The two of them were laughing, high-fiving, and backslapping, and they just ignored us as we tried to intervene. The only time Dan acknowledged me was to look me in the eye and say as cold as ice, checkmate, and for Jack to yell as they were driving off, "Fuck off, Tom." Since then, Jack has gone totally no contact with me. He talks a little bit to Alyssa, and from the little he does tell her, he's doing well, and Dan is giving him the royal treatment, bringing him to steakhouses, Yankees games, and just giving him outright cash. It has been almost a year, and I'm going crazy thinking I've lost my son. There could be a little confusion here about whether Alyssa is my bio daughter or stepdaughter. She is my stepdaughter. We really have a mother-daughter relationship to the point where it doesn't even occur to me to call her my step. At the risk of understatement, Jack never warmed to Tom the same way. Jack never really got into that much trouble and is largely a good kid. He'd sometimes get into fights, but that all cleared up a few years ago. We'd usually just ground him and make him do extra chores, and that was enough. Recently, it was maybe grounding him for a weekend here or there for exceeding his curfew. I can't say I had a fully formed plan on what the discipline would be for the prank alone, since it all kind of happened at once, but to me at least, the big thing was the prank, and telling Tom to F off definitely mattered, but was small potatoes compared to that. But less so to Tom, for obvious reasons. I wasn't very kind to Dan when the marriage broke down and could have been more equitable with custody matters in the divorce, which created a lot of bad blood from Dan's side. As much as I'd like to agree that I just have to wait for Dan to get sick of throwing money at Jack, I can't deny that Dan actually does pretty well by Jack, and also that he likely isn't going to be running short on money anytime soon. I spent every day with Dan for so many years and know that man very well. He is an extremely calculative man. His exact thought process was that he saw the perfect opportunity to take his son back after years of feeling slighted through the divorce process and then get with everything he had. It worked. Dan always plays the long game, just like I'm sure he's going to play the long game to keep things the way they are. Tom truly loves Jack. If it was simple gamesmanship, I think he wouldn't have been so brutal about it. He truly feels I stole his son. My son just never respected Tom as any kind of authority figure. Even as a young child, if Tom would tell him to do something, he'd tell Tom that he was just a rude guest in his house. I can't prove it, but I have to think Dan had a hand in it. How else would Jack know that it was my money from the divorce that bought the house and that Tom was broke? About Jack calling Dan with his side of the story, I have no idea how he did that. I had his phone locked away for 2 weeks when that happened. I suspect that his girlfriend Jess somehow had a hand in it even though he was barred from seeing Jess. Part of the reason I think is that this arrangement works out so well for her. She is going to NYU for college, and somehow Dan pulled some stunt to get Jack into Temple in Philly. So they take turns spending weekends with each other in either New York or Philly. Dan's Instagram post from last week was the three of them having dinner together at Peter Luger's. I just feel so stupid. I know Dan. He has been waiting years for an opportunity like this, and I handed him the perfect storm. I am not proud of it, but I did not treat Dan very well towards the end of the marriage. To be clear, I never cheated on him though. But he has hated me since then. Also, since he doesn't live with me anymore, child support is terminated. We divorced in New York where child support goes to 21. I even know how I'm going to make next month's mortgage. Dan is a very high earner, so it was a big check. He can actually go after me now for child support, and my lawyer tells me he has already filed the paperwork for that. Tom is on disability. I knew I'd have a problem in 3 years when Jack aged out of child support, but I was hoping Tom would be back to work by then. I do pretty well, but not like Dan. I used to do better before COVID. At the time of the divorce, I won a very high household income split. It was good for me back then since he had to pay me. Now, I have to pay Dan my portion of that very high number. So, I get the double whammy of losing the checks I was getting, and now I have to write big checks his way. I tried to introduce Tom slowly, and things started out of the box. They were never warm, but it was peaceful. Things started getting rougher when Tom moved in. He had an accident at work and got behind on bills. It was a little sooner than we would have liked, but Jack had known him for a year at that point. It started with little things, like Tom telling Jack to clean his room, or put away his plates or mow the lawn. Jack just wouldn't do it. I noticed that every time Dan flew down to spend a weekend with Jack, it got a bit worse. I remember a few years ago overhearing Jack on the phone call Tom my pet loser, a phrase I know Dan has used about others before. When Jack was 16, there was one time that Tom's back was hurting and he told Jack to warm him up a plate of leftovers. Jack was playing a game and told him to get it himself. Tom unplugged his Xbox and then Jack said, "This F guy. He stays here for free, eats free food, and now even thinks he has a butler. This isn't that hotel, Tom. You can't afford one." Then another time when Tom told him to mow the lawn and Jack said, "Don't tell me to mow the lawn at my own house. You mow the lawn and make me a sandwich when you're done." Jack isn't like this with anyone else. He's usually very kind, quick-witted, and gracious. The thing that freaks me out is that he is almost exactly like his father. If he likes you, he'll be as debonair and smooth as can be. But if he doesn't, he really doesn't. And he truly hates Tom. The end of the marriage wasn't pretty. I have to take responsibility for that, and the divorce was very contentious. Following that, there was a lot of bad blood, but it definitely got worse once Tom entered the picture. Jack has blocked my number. Alyssa does still talk with him a bit since they had a cordial enough relationship. She even offered to give him the car back to make peace. He told her to keep it since he has a better car now and told her that he doesn't have any bad blood against her. For a while, he was telling her that he'd never forgive me. He appreciates that he did wrong, but that I took it way too far by taking the car away and because I wouldn't let him see Jess for a month. So Alyssa is acting as a bit of a back channel. However, she's still so young, and I don't like asking her to be in the middle of it, which must be hard because it really pains her how she sees Jack as a big brother and how bad Jack's relationship is with her father. I sent him emails where I apologized for giving his car to Alyssa, for screaming at him, for trying to force a relationship with Tom on him, and for taking the money. He has never responded. On the advice of some of the posters, I reached out to Dan to see if he'd be willing to consider brokering peace between me and Jack. About a week later, I got a response telling me to meet him and Jack at a cafe in Manhattan. He arranged a 6 a.m. flight and put me in a dodgy hotel in probably the most dangerous neighborhood in New York City. I arrived and saw Dan, Jack, Jack's girlfriend Jess, and his friend from a past firm, Jonathan. I noticed Jess had an engagement ring on her finger. Jonathan said Jack has a claim against me for stealing the $840, and until that is resolved, I am not to contact him, but to only contact Jonathan. I told Jonathan that's the money his friends paid in for the prank and that I gave to the girl. Jonathan said he was aware of the circumstances, but nonetheless it wasn't my money and under the law, it was a theft and Jack has a legal claim against me. I said I don't care if it was against the law. Jack had no right to that money and they could sue me if they wanted. Jack said, "You locked me up in my room like a prisoner for a month, took the car bought for me with Dad's child support money, took the money and berated me for hours on end. Unless you're going to give me the car, this is the only thing you can undo. You said you wished we could have handled it better, so here is your chance." Or was that just bullshit lip service? I told him I was sorry, but I can't do it. Jonathan then gave me a cease and desist letter telling me to not contact Jack and to address all communication to Jonathan. Then Jack and Jess left, and I asked Dan if he could talk for a minute. I asked him if he brought me there to humiliate me, and he said actually no, he didn't. He brought me so I could humiliate myself. He'd actually worked very hard to get Jack to the point where he'd be open to talking to me again if I were willing to back down just a little. But since he knew that if I had to choose between my indignation and my own son, that I'd choose my indignation every time just like I did in our marriage. I asked him why he'd put us all through that. He said it was because a part of him wondered if I'd ever learn to pick love over anger. He'd bet his future that I wouldn't when he divorced me. So he had to see for himself how it actually turned out after all these years later. I asked him if Jack was just a pawn in his game. He said no. If I actually would have picked Jack, he'd be with me now, and there would have been nothing anyone could have done to stop it. But instead, my indignation over a stranger was more important to me than learning to move on with my own son. I asked him, "What about the girl?" He then said, "I hope she'll be a wonderful daughter to you since you lost a son for her." I told her I don't know the girl. So then he said, "Sounds like a bad trade," and left. Also, I'm apparently not invited to Jack's wedding. If you lose your only child, nothing else really matters. I didn't understand that before. Hopefully, you never do. On if I would be willing to divorce Tom to get Jack back. If I had to, yes. Truthfully, that's kind of been falling apart anyway, and the only reason I hadn't divorced him is because I don't want to lose Alyssa. I should never have touched the car. I should have just grounded him, insisted on the apology, and maybe also made him hand over the money. Losing a relationship with a child is a hell of a thing. It is like death. I hate what he did. But there is nothing worth losing a child over. I lost my son for that girl who I don't even know. The irony is that now I'm sitting where he was, except worse. I'd do anything for him back. I was so angry. I am still so angry. He was sitting there, smug as can be with his little girlfriend, my ex-husband, and my ex's best friend there as his lawyer. At that moment, I just couldn't. The whole thing was to humiliate me. They stuck me in a cracked inn of a hotel, made me trek all over New York. Then they all show up laughing and backslapping, and the lawyer tells me I can't talk to my own son unless I pay him $800. I just don't even know what to do anymore. Dan reversed the polarity on the child support, and I'm now a few months behind on the mortgage, and the hole gets deeper and deeper. I placed my house for sale on the market. I'm just at wit's end.